Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're breaking down a question that every elk hunter has wrestled with at some point. Should you be spot and stalking or sitting tight in an ambush? The truth is, both tactics can put elk on the ground, but knowing when each one works best can mean the difference between burning boot leather all season and finally getting a shot. Too many hunters lock themselves into just one approach. They either run the mountains nonstop, chasing every bugle until they're worn out, or they park themselves on a wallow or meadow and hope that elk show up. The problem is elk behavior isn't static. It changes with every stage of the rut. In the early season, bulls are scattered, moving on their own, and less tied down to cows. During the peak rut, the mountains explode with bugles, right? Herds bunch up, and calling chaos can make slipping in tricky. And by post-rut, bulls are worn down, wary, and often shifting to food and recovery patterns. In this episode, I want to break down which tactic, spot and stalk or ambush, fits best at each rut stage, why it works, and how to adjust when conditions or elk behavior change. In the early part of September, before the rut really heats up, elk are in a transition. The velvet is stripped, bulls are starting to test each other, and you might hear a few bugles scattered across the ridges, but the mountains aren't on fire yet. This stage can throw hunters off because they expect the chaos of the peak rut right out of the gate, and when it doesn't happen, doubt sets in. The key thing to understand is that in the early rut, elk are still in more of a summer pattern than a full rut pattern. Bulls are often running solo or loosely grouped with other bulls. They're feeding heavy, bedding in predictable spots, and moving along well-worn routes between food, water, and cover. Cows are beginning to gather up, but they're not fully locked down with herd bulls yet. That means behavior is subtle, less calling, less obvious sign, and much more reliance on you being able to read the country and the conditions. Early rut elk are also more sensitive to pressure. With bugles scarce, hunters can't rely on sound to cover their approach, and every mistake with wind, noise, or movement carries more weight. If you bust a bull in early rut, he's likely to vanish into the timber and not give you another chance that day. This is why many hunters burn themselves out in the first week. They're charging hard like it's peak rut when the elk aren't really acting like elk that way yet. Another thing to keep in mind is the time of day. In early September, with warmer weather hanging on, bulls often feed late into the night and bed down early in the morning. That makes midday movement quieter and shorter. If you're expecting elk to be up and visible all day, you're going to feel like the mountains are empty. But if you pay attention to shadow lines, thermal shifts, and small pockets of feed near security cover, you can start to predict exactly where they're going to stage. This stage of the rut is all about observation and patience. You want to glass the fringes of meadows, pay attention to faint bugles that might only happen once every hour, and don't ignore fresh sign just because you didn't hear an elk. Tracks, droppings, rubbed trees, churned up wallows, those all tell a story of elk starting to move into their rut ranges. If you can piece that puzzle together before the masses of hunters roll in, you'll already know where the bulls are staging and where they're likely to be when things do finally heat up. The bottom line is simple here. In the early rut, you're not playing the same loud calling game you'll play in mid-September. You're reading, subtle clues, trusting your glass and your boots, and preparing for that shift when the bugles finally take over. When you're dealing with the early rut, spot and stalk can shine if you approach it the right way. Remember, this is the window when many bulls are still running solo or loosely grouped with other bulls before they've locked onto cows. They're more predictable in their travel patterns and less distracted by herd dynamics. If you can find them, you often get a cleaner opportunity than you will in the chaos of the peak rut. The first step here in making spot and stalk work is covering country. You can't sit back and wait for bulls to pipe off bugles like they will later in September. Instead, you're going to have to rely on glass and boot leather. Get up on vantage points where you can see long stretches of meadow edges, avalanche chutes, and transition zones between timber and open feed. Early in the morning and the last hour before dark are your best windows for catching those bulls on their feet. Once you locate a bull, the real work begins. This isn't a sprint. Early rut elk aren't screaming, so you don't have the luxury of noise to cover your approach. Every move you make has to be calculated. Pay close attention to thermals. Air's going to be dropping early in the morning, and then it's going to rise throughout the day with the sunshine, and then in the evening it's going to drop again. You've got to pay attention to those. If you try to slip in without considering it, you're going to blow the whole basin out without ever getting close. I like to sit and watch for a bit before I move. Figure out a bull's patience, the direction he favors, and whether he's alone or shadowed by another bull. That extra 5 minutes of observation can make the difference between sliding in undetected and watching him blow out the back door. One of the biggest mistakes hunters often make when spot and stalking in the early rut is pushing too aggressively. They get eyes on a bull, and instead of letting the elk make the mistake, they try to force the encounter. These bulls are still on edge from summer survival patterns. They're not yet distracted by cows. If they sense pressure, they'll fade into the timber where you can't follow. The better approach is to anticipate where they're heading. Look at the terrain and think like an elk. Pull up your onX. Where's the next pocket of shade? Where's the nearest water source? What's the cleanest line between feeding and bedding? If you can get ahead of them instead of chasing them from behind, you dramatically increase your odds exponentially. The other piece of spot and stalk in this phase is patience. You might glass a bull, make a play, and lose him. Don't assume the opportunity is gone for good, right? Early rut bulls often bed within a few hundred yards of where you last saw them. If you back out, circle with the wind in your favor, take your time, give him time, you might relocate him and still get a crack before the day is done. Spot and stalk in the early rut isn't about calling contests or big dramatic setups. It's about reading sign, moving deliberately, and playing the quiet game. If you can keep your discipline and let the bull show you his habits, you can oftentimes get close enough to make a shot before he ever knows you're in his world. Now, while spot and stalk gets a lot of attention in the early rut, ambush setups can be just as deadly if you know where to put yourself. This time of year, bulls are still transitioning from summer to rut ranges. Their movements are more predictable, tied to feed, water, and bedding. If you can figure out those daily patterns, setting an ambush along their travel route can be, the way to put the odds in your favor without burning yourself out just chasing. One of the best ambush locations in early September is along travel corridors. Bulls moving from alpine basins down to timbered bedding areas usually funnel through specific saddles, benches, and side hills. You won't always hear them, but the ground is going to tell you where they've been, right? You're looking for the trails that are well beaten, fresh rubs just starting to show up, and clusters of poop that confirm recent use. If you set up on these routes with the wind in your favor, especially in the first or last couple hours of daylight, you can intercept a bull slipping quietly through. Another prime setup is water. Early season hunts often overlap with warm weather, and bulls need to hydrate consistently. Wallows, seeps, and small creeks become magnets. Even if a bull isn't rolling in the mud yet, he'll swing through for a drink on his way to or from feed. Setting an ambush on a water source gives you an edge because elk are naturally drawn there every day. You just have to be smart about how you approach and set up. Don't walk the same trail the elk are using, and try not to hang a stand or a blind in a spot where thermals are going to give you away if they're swirling. If your scent gets into the water hole before the elk do, they'll pattern you faster than you can pattern them. The beauty of ambush hunting in the early rut is that you don't need elk to be vocal for it to work. While other hunters are frustrated at the lack of bugles, you can stay disciplined, let the elk move naturally, and be waiting where you know they'll pass. The hardest part is sitting still long enough. Early rut ambush hunting is a patience game, right? It's like tree stand hunting, and a lot of guys lose it because they feel like they need to move. If you've done your homework, pick the right location, and the sign is fresh, try to just trust the process. One mistake a lot of hunters make in this phase is setting up in open meadows. Elk might pass through at night, but by daylight, they're already going to be back in the cover, right? So I think it's a low percentage play. Instead, tighten up closer to bedding areas or stage on the edges of cover leading into feed. You want to be in the zone where the elk feel comfortable moving during the legal shooting light. Ambush setups don't get the spotlight because they're not flashy, but if you can key in on the right corridor or water source, they can be one of the most consistent ways to notch a tag during the early rut. Now, by mid to late September, the mountains are alive with bugles, or we hope they are, right? This is what most hunters dream about all summer, the peak of the rut. Herd bulls are pushing cows, satellites are circling, and every drainage seems to echo with activity. It's exciting, but it can also overwhelm hunters who don't know how to read the chaos. If, the early rut is about subtlety, the peak rut is about managing noise, pressure, and opportunities without getting caught up in the frenzy. At this stage, herd dynamics are in full swing. The biggest bulls have gathered groups of cows and they're spending more time defending than feeding. You'll see bulls chasing off challengers, bugling back and forth, and moving constantly to keep their harems together. It's thrilling, but it makes them hard to approach directly, right? When a bull is locked on cows, his attention is divided and he won't abandon them easily for a call. That means your strategy has to adapt. The satellites add another wrinkle. These younger or smaller bulls hang on the edges of the chaos, waiting for an opportunity to steal a cow. They're vocal a lot of times, they're curious, and they can be easier to call in. But they're also wary because they've been pushed around by the big boys. If you decide to go after satellites, you have to be ready for quick encounters and unpredictable movement. The other challenge of peak rut is pressure. Hunters know this is when elk are most active, and that means trailheads are packed and every ridge can hold competition. All that calling and movement from other hunters can educate bulls fast. A bugle that might have drawn a bull in 3 days ago now gets ignored, or worse, it pushes him further into cover. The best hunters in peak rut don't just call more, they call smarter. They read the intensity of the bugles, the number of the cows, and the pressure in the area before they make a move. Timing matters too. In peak rut, elk are often most vocal at night and during the first and last couple hours of daylight. Midday can get quieter, but don't assume the show is over. Herds still move to water, bulls still push cows, and satellites still prowl. If you can shadow them without blowing your cover, you'll often catch opportunities other hunters miss by heading back to camp too early. The takeaway in peak rut is this. Elk are highly visible, highly vocal, and highly pressured. That combination creates both chaos and opportunity. If you can discipline yourself to slow down, read the herd's mood, and think one step ahead, you can capitalize while others are chasing bugles blindly. This is where knowing whether to stalk or ambush really matters, because the right call at the right time can crack the code when everything around you feels unpredictable. Spot and stalk during the peak rut is a whole different animal than it is in early September. You're no longer dealing with solitary bulls casually moving between feed and bed. Now you're looking at big herd bulls surrounded by cows, satellites circling the edges, and bugles hopefully echoing all over the drainage. It's exciting, but it also makes getting close without blowing the entire herd a real challenge. The first rule of spot and stalk in peak rut is observation. Don't charge in there the moment you hear the first bugles. Take the time to figure out the herd's direction of travel. Where are they feeding? Where are they bedding? How many cows are in the group? Where are the satellites hanging out? Every herd seems to have a rhythm, and if you bust it too fast, you'll spook not just the bull, but the entire group. Once cows start running, the herd bull is gone with them, and you're left with nothing but dust and echoes. Wind is the absolute non-negotiable here. With so many eyes, ears, and noses in the herd, your scent is the number one way you'll get busted. In peak rut, herds cover ground and shift elevation quickly, and they can be spread out over a big area, which means thermals can change under your feet. Mornings, early mornings, the air is dropping, right? After the sun warms, midday is rising, right? All the way up until evening when it switches and goes downhill again. If you're not constantly testing wind and thermals and adjusting your angle, you're going to be outed before you ever see antler tips. The second key here is using terrain as your ally. Herds are noisy, but don't assume that it covers all your mistakes, right? Instead, use the folds in the land, brush lines, tree lines, ridges to shield your approach. Move when the herd is noisy, when the bull is screaming, when cows are mewing, when hooves are breaking sticks. Freeze when it's quiet. Hold out. Listen. This is where patience separates filled tags from blown opportunities. Another factor to consider with spot and stalk in peak rut is the satellite bulls. While you're making a play on the herd bull, there's often a satellite tucked in close. He may not be bugling much or at all, but he's watching and listening. And if you bump him, he'll blow out and take the herd with him. Always scan for those satellites before you try to close the gap. A lot of hunters stalk the noise and forget about the quiet bulls shadowing on the fringes. Now, the final piece here with the spot and stalk is knowing when not to stalk. Sometimes a herd is moving too fast, cows are too nervous, or wind is too unpredictable. In those cases, you're better off shadowing them at a safe distance and waiting for a better setup. Pushing in under the wrong conditions just educates the entire group and kills your chance tomorrow. Patience wins here more than aggression in peak rut and with spot and stalk. The reward for doing this right is huge. If you can slip in undetected and cut off the herd's travel line, you will find yourself inside the bubble, close enough to see the bull's breath and hear the cows shuffle. That's the moment when all the discipline pays off. Ambush hunting, on the other hand, often gets overlooked during the peak rut, right? Because the mountains are so alive with sound. Hunters feel like they should always be chasing bugles, running from ridge to ridge to stay in the action. But if you slow down and think about how elk actually move during this stage, an ambush setup can be one of the smartest ways to tag out. During peak rut, cows drive the show, right? Herd bulls are glued to them, satellites are drawn in by them, and the daily movements of the entire group revolve around food, water, and bedding and where the cows are headed. That means if you can find the pinch points and cow magnets, the places they naturally funnel through, you can put yourself in position without ever bugling once. One of the best ambush setups in peak rut is along pinch points between bedding and feeding areas. Herds often use the same saddles, benches, and timber draws to travel each day. If you've scouted and found where these trails pinch together, you can slip in with the wind right and wait. The beauty here is that you're not gambling on calling a bull away from his cows. Instead, you're intercepting the whole group as they move through a place they're going to use anyway. Water is another cow magnet that holds power in the peak rut. Cows need to drink regularly, and the bull keeping them together has no choice but to follow. Setting up downwind of a well-used wallow, seep, or creek crossing can give you a close-range opportunity as the herd cycles through. This works especially well in the afternoons when elk are staging before heading out to evening feed. Now, another overlooked ambush spot is staging areas. Those pockets of cover just off an open meadow or feeding flat. Cows will often hang up in these spots at first light or before dark, waiting until they feel safe to step into the open. If you're tucked into the edge of one of these staging zones, you're sitting in a natural traffic hub where the herd bull will often circle and check cows before they move. The key to ambush hunting in peak rut is discipline. You might hear bugles blowing up the canyon and the temptation is to run after them. But if the sign is there, if you know cows are using a trail, water, or staging pocket, the smartest play could be to hold your ground. Elk are creatures of habit, and herds will cycle through the same patterns until something like pressure, weather, or danger forces a change. By sitting still, you can often take advantage of that predictability while other hunters burn themselves out chasing sound. The downside here is, again, it requires that discipline, that patience. You may sit for hours before anything happens, but when it does, it happens fast. The entire herd can file past in a matter of minutes, and if you've picked the right funnel, you're suddenly in bow range of the bull every other hunter has been screaming at from a mile away. Ambush in peak rut isn't glamorous, it's tactical. It leverages the natural movements of elk and removes the chaos of trying to outcall or outrun the competition. When everyone else is chasing noise, the hunter who waits in the right spot can walk away heavy. As September fades into October, the rut begins to wind down. The once nonstop bugling slows, the chaos of bulls chasing cows starts to taper off, and the mountains get quieter by the day. For many hunters, this is the most frustrating stage because elk seem to disappear. In reality, they haven't vanished. They're simply shifting into post-rut survival mode. And if you understand what drives them now, you can still find success. By this point, herd bulls are worn down. Weeks of chasing, fighting, and breeding take a toll. Their bodies are depleted, fat reserves are low, and their priorities change. Instead of burning energy on cows, the main focus becomes recovery. Food, water, and security. You'll often find them breaking away from the main herds to bed in secluded pockets, sometimes alone, sometimes with a handful of satellite bulls. They don't want the pressure of holding cows anymore. They want to rest, feed, and be safe. Cow groups also change their behavior in the post-rut. Without bulls dogging them as intensely, cows often shift into calmer routines, focusing on predictable feeding and bedding patterns. They may drop lower in elevation, especially if snow starts to push in, or they may stick to mid-level timber where feed is still available and cover is thick. Because of that, glassing big, obvious meadows doesn't always pay off the way it did earlier in the month. You've got to dig into the less glamorous country, dark timber benches, second growth thickets, and hidden drainages where pressure is lighter. One of the most telling signs of the post-rut is the change in vocalization. Bulls that once bugled relentlessly may only let out a half-hearted bugle or two in the morning, if at all. Cow calling can still spark curiosity, but don't expect any kind of aggressive, fast-charging response like you did in mid-September. Instead, elk are quieter, more cautious, and less likely to cover ground to investigate. This is where patience and woodsmanship take over from high-energy calling sequences. Another factor at play is hunting pressure. By this time, many hunters are worn out or have already tagged out. Those who remain often push deeper into overlooked spots, which can bump elk into refuge areas. Bulls especially will retreat to overlooked holes, steep drainages, nasty deadfall pockets, or tucked away benches where few hunters bother to go. If you're willing to grind into these places, you'll often find bulls recovering and feeding away from the easy country. The weather also plays a big role. Early snows or cold snaps can accelerate movement, pushing elk into lower country where food is easier to find. Warm weather, on the other hand, can keep them in mid-elevation timber longer. Either way, the driving force now is conservation and energy. Elk want to rebuild strength before winter, and that dictates where they bed, feed, and travel. The post-rut isn't flashy. You won't hear bugles echoing all day. You're not going to see bulls running cows across meadows. But if you understand that they're shifting from chaos to recovery, you can still be right in the game. This stage rewards hunters who slow down, pay attention to subtle sign, and respect how drastically elk behavior changes once the rut is behind them. Spot and stalk in the post-rut is a different game than in early or during the peak September rut. The noise is gone. The big bulls are no longer screaming their lungs out or chasing cows across open ridges. Instead, they've slipped back into survival mode, quiet, deliberate, and focused on conserving energy. That makes them harder to locate, but once you do find them, they can be more killable because they're sticking to tight, predictable patterns. The foundation of post-rut spot and stalk is sign reading. You can't rely on bugles to give away locations. You've got to pay attention to the ground. Fresh tracks, steaming poop, chewed up feeding pockets. Those are your roadmap. A lot of hunters get discouraged when they don't hear elk, but if the sign is there, the elk are there, right? The key is trusting those clues and piecing together a picture of how the animals are using the country day to day. Security cover also becomes the priority for bulls in this phase. After weeks of fighting and running, they want thick, safe bedding areas where they can lay down during the day. That often means north-facing timber benches, dark drainages, and deadfall, or side hills where pressure is very minimal. Your job is to slip into those areas without tipping them off. That means slowing your pace way down, sometimes only covering a couple hundred yards an hour. Every step needs to be quiet, deliberate, and paired with constant checks of the wind. Wind, in fact, becomes even more critical in the post-rut because bulls are just laying around, right? A lot of times in those pockets. They're not distracted by cows anymore. Their guard is up. If your scent drifts into their pocket, they're gone, and you probably won't get a second chance in that drainage. Thermals still shift through the day, right? They're dropping early in the morning and later in the evening, and they're rising throughout the middle of the day. And you need to move accordingly. If the wind isn't right, don't force it. Circle, wait, or back out and try again later. Another tactic that works well is shadowing fresh sign. If you cut tracks that are still sharp in the dirt or snow, don't just look at them. Follow them carefully with the wind in your favor. This can be a killer tactic, right? Post-rut bulls often feed through the night and into early morning, then bed close to where they last fed. If you stay patient and keep following the line of sight, you can sometimes stalk right into their bedding area and catch them unaware. The hardest part of post-rut stalking is mental. You're not getting the instant feedback of bugles or cow chatter. You may go hours in silence, second-guessing whether you're even close. That's where discipline comes in. Trust the sign, trust the terrain, trust that they're there, just quieter. If you can keep your confidence when the woods go still, you're probably ahead of most hunters who give up and head home. Spot and stalk in the post-rut isn't about fast action or dramatic calling battles. It's about patience, stealth, and trusting your woodsmanship. If you can master that mindset, you'll still be able to find bulls after the bugles have faded. When the rut winds down, ambush setups take a whole new level of importance. In September, elk are unpredictable. Herd bulls chasing cows, satellites darting in, bugles pulling you one way and then another. But in the post-rut, everything simplifies. Bulls are tired, cows are calmer, and movement becomes more routine. That predictability is what makes ambush hunting in the post-rut so effective. The driving force now is recovery. Bulls that burn thousands of calories during the rut are laser focused on food and rest. They'll feed heavily through the night and early morning, then bed in thick, secure cover for most of the day. In the evenings, they'll repeat the cycle, moving back out toward feeding areas. If you can locate those feeding, bedding travel routes, you can often set up in a place where elk will pass within bow range even, or better yet, if you're a rifle hunter, definitely within range. The trick here, though, is finding the right ambush point. Unlike the chaos of peak rut, post-rut setups aren't about pinch points between multiple herds, right? Instead, they're about quiet, subtle travel corridors, timbered benches, saddle between bedding pockets, or well-worn trails dropping into meadows. Look for fresh tracks, fresh poop, and browse lines along the trail. If the sign is hot, elk are using it consistently. Food sources are another big draw here. Depending on your region, that could be remaining green grass, agricultural edges, or browse pockets tucked into timber. Bulls need calories, and they'll return to those food sources regularly and consistently until snow drives them elsewhere. An ambush on the downwind edge of one of those feeding areas, especially in the last hour of daylight, can put you in the middle of steady action. Water can still play a role in post-rut as well, but it's less about wallowing and more about necessity, right? If the country is dry, ambush setups near reliable water can really pay off. Focus on your sits on mornings and evenings when they're still transitioning in and out of bedding. The biggest mistake a lot of guys make with post-rut ambush setups is picking locations that look elky but don't show the fresh sign. In this phase, elk aren't roaming widely. They're sticking to tight patterns. If you're not seeing tracks or poop, you're probably sitting dead ground. Don't waste hours in a spot just because it looks good. Move until you find proof that the elk are actively using that area. Patience is the final ingredient here. Ambush hunting in the post-rut can mean long sits in the cold, watching shadows creep while you wait for elk to slip out of cover. But when they do, it often happens in a rush. A group of cows stepping onto a trail followed by a bull dragging his feet but still committed to his routine. That's when your discipline can pay off. Ambush hunting at this stage may not have the adrenaline of bull screaming at 40 yards, but it can play to predictability and recovery. If you can identify the food, the cover, and the travel routes that connect them, you can quietly intercept elk even after the mountain has gone silent. At the end of the day, spot and stalk and ambush aren't enemies. They're both tools, right? The best hunters don't marry themselves to one method. They learn to pull the right tool out of the toolbox based on what the elk are doing that week, that day, and even that hour. In the early rut, when bulls are scattered and quiet, stalking works when you're willing to cover ground, glass hard, and slip in undetected. Ambush shines if you've dialed in travel routes and water. By the peak rut, with chaos filling the canyons, stalking is about patience, timing, and slipping in when the herd bull is distracted. Ambush is about discipline, holding ground on cow magnets and letting the herd cycle right past you. And in the post rut, when things get quiet, stalking becomes a slow, sign-driven game, while ambush rewards hunters who can identify predictable food to bedding routines. The real lesson is adaptability. Elk don't read playbooks. They respond to pressure, weather, and instinct. Your job is to read them honestly and make the right call. Some days that means crawling ridge to ridge, chasing the faintest bugle. Other days it means sitting in the shadows of a trail for hours. Both can work if you use them at the right time. Every hunter wants a perfect formula, but the truth is there isn't one. Elk change with every stage of the rut, and so should you. If you can let go of stubbornness, if you can stop trying to force the mountains to fit your favorite style and instead learn to adapt, your odds are gonna skyrocket. The guys who consistently fill tags aren't always the best callers or strongest hikers. They're the ones who stay flexible, read the situation, and play the right card at the right time. If this kind of breakdown helps you, that's exactly what I built Team Backbone for. It's our inner circle of hunters who live relentless and want more out of their gear, their strategy, and themselves. Members get 20% off site-wide, exclusive monthly shirts, full access to the digital content vault of training, strategy, and checklists, plus direct access to me for personalized advice. We also connect inside the private Team Backbone group, a community of guys who push each other forward. If you're serious about sharpening your edge and being part of a tribe that's built for relentless living, check it out at backboneunlimited.com under our membership tab. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.